I find it hard to believe that the Americans left because of the Iraqi resistance, but anything is possible. I mean, certainly the resistance was strong for a long time, wasn't it? The Americans were kind of
The resistance was the reason the Americans left. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that they were the reason the Americans left. If you saw what happened in Iraq in 2006, and from 2004 to 2007, the number of American soldiers that were being killed and injured, because, being killed can be the same as being injured. A casualty is a casualty in terms of military. When you have a man out, he's out. And the number of casualties that Americans suffered were not just the number of killed that were reported. You have to also consider that 30,000 were wounded. 30,000, as far as I know from the last time I heard. And that number would have increased dramatically. The Americans pulled their troops back into their bases. But this was, a defensive move, and also after much negotiation with both the resistance in the south and Iran. So I'm not sure if they really did broker any deals with the resistance in the north, because there's resistance factions that fought them until the end. And even on the last day that they left Iraq, one of their men died in Basra, which is a south city. So the resistance was relentless, and there was no way out for the Americans. It was a quagmire. They didn't want to leave. Okay, and I don't believe, in fact, that they have left completely. I believe the war is still going, because they still have a giant embassy in the Green Zone. They still have their mercenaries running around the country, and the traitors are still in power. So until such time where the traitors are hanging in the street, victory cannot be truly declared. So, yes, I grew up with this war, so it's for me the most disbelief that, in a way, a part of it is over. But don't doubt that if it weren't for the Iraqi resistance, Iran would have had nothing to blackmail the Americans with in order to push them out of Iraq.
You mentioned the American casualties and deaths. I think nobody really believes the figures anyway, that in fact, in reality, a lot more died than they're admitting, and a lot of people were like mercenaries in military uniform, and they never got a statistic.
Well, it's not just that.
A statistic.
There's many things with this. First of all, the green card soldiers were never reported on, and one of the fathers of one of the green card soldiers are basically South Americans that want a green card in the U.S., and they were offered a way to get that by fighting in Iraq. Now, they aren't U.S. citizens, so their death is never reported, and the father of one of these green card soldiers actually complained and went on camera about it, but that's all you ever heard about them. So that's some of the numbers. Secondly, you have the mercenaries, and they're not reported on either. And then on top of this, the Iraqi resistance actually found a mass grave near the Anbar province in plastic bags and with US dog tags, and there's video of it which I've uploaded onto my channel, and I'm sure we will link that later. And also, there's been so many mix-ups with the bodies that have arrived in the US that are supposed to be these fallen soldiers, and supposedly people get their son in a coffin, but in fact it wasn't their son, it was somebody else, and all of this confusion has been happening. And lastly, the last report I heard was just last year, where a mass grave was uncovered in a US base in America with like up to 1,000 troops in it, and this was on the Washington Post. So yes, the numbers were fudged. It's hard to believe that there's ever been a war in history where the casualties were not lied about on both sides of the war.
The Americans made a big deal out of the they called it like the Sunni resistance that they, well, you say corrupted, they bought off. There was a word, a jargon word for them. I forgot
The Awakening
what they were
Council?
called. Yes.
Yeah, the Awakening Council.
I mean, they must have been bad news for the resistance.
That was a very bad news, like, that was bad news for the resistance. The Awakening Council was not made up of the resistance. Mostly it was made up of Sunni people that just wanted a slice of the cake, because the Shiite government was given most of the slice of the cake, the power, I'm talking about the power cake of governing Iraq, and the Awakening Council was their way of getting that. For them though, unfortunately for them, that at the end, you know, once their use was finished, most of them got assassinated. And it wasn't even, they were picked up quietly, and it wasn't even very much in the media, because, you know, there's not much honor amongst thieves. So, very few in the resistance actually joined this Awakening Council. And even though, you know, in the US media, one of the factions that was supposedly have joined this Awakening Council was the 1920s Revolutionary Brigades, previously known as Rafidan Central Command, which is the resistance group that I am you know, most attached to. And they were supposed to have joined this Awakening Council, but they went on record and released a communique that said that no way, well, there's no way in hell we would ever ally with the occupiers, even though we are against Al-Qaeda. Now, the whole Awakening Council idea was that the Sunni people were, you know, allying themselves with the Americans to kick out Al-Qaeda, whereas the resistance knew all along that Al-Qaeda was just a tool of the Americans, and they fought them since day one. In fact, you know, since in the beginning of the war in 2003, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was only up until 2005, 2006 where these puppets that were thinking they were part of Al-Qaeda started to infiltrate inside Iraq and try to take over the resistance. Because as you know, the powers that be, they like to control both sides of the war. They want to control both the occupiers and the opposition. And the resistance was a completely independent resistance movement. You know, it didn't have a state backing. It didn't have anybody on side.
You know, the resistance became so strong in Iraq, one wonders if it had been planned in advance, if they were ready and waiting, or they just formed as a reaction.
Yes and no. Part of them had experience being ex-military. Part of them had, you know, very basic training in the lead-up of the war. Some militias and Minutemen, paramilitaries were set up because the Iraqis knew in advance that the Americans were coming, because there was a big lead-up to the war and it's very public. So yes, part of them had some military training, but in the other half had none whatsoever. And a lot of them were just made up of youths, you know, just patriotic, honorable young people that didn't really have anything to do with politics or military in the past. So the answer to that is yes and no. You know, at the beginning, they did fight the Americans as a militia, but then when the army was disbanded, the resistance began to formulate from the bottom up. So it was people in the neighborhood that knew each other that came together and formed a small cell. And then this small cell would join up with another cell, and so on and so forth, until you had a larger resistance group. And so from this grassroots growing of the resistance, you see something quite unique to the resistance that doesn't really, hasn't really existed too much in other movements, that there wasn't one leadership that the Americans could point to and demonize. You know, there wasn't a figurehead to the resistance. And so they had to try to create that.
You know, one of the very effective weapons of the resistance was the IED. The
Yes.
IEDs going through the vehicles. I mean, that took a lot of sophistication. It's hard to believe just, you know, local youths worked it out. it certainly set the Americans back.
Well, they had engineers among them. They had teachers. They had lawyers. They had shopkeepers, farmers. From all walks of life, and of course, engineers and chemists were among them. And there are videos, and I have seen these videos of the resistance building the bombs, mixing the chemicals, setting up the iodine, setting up the fuses, and they used the fuses of the toy guns, not the fuses, the transmitters. So yes, it was all homegrown, and even the Americans were shocked at the ingenuity of the Iraqis because they didn't have a state helping them. They didn't have a backer. They were on their own, but they fought, to the death, basically, with everything that they had.
The Americans kept accusing Syria of allowing weapons and people across the border.
Look, if there was any state that aided the Iraqi resistance, the closest thing that the state would have been is Syria. Because Syria opened up the border, okay? And the Americans became very angry with Syria for this reason. And in a way, it wasn't exactly what Iran intended for Syria to do either, but it was within Syria's interests to help the Iraqis defeat the imperialists, because we knew that we were next. And we knew that the Iraqi resistance, their fight, was to save our lives as well. Now, many in Syria have, they would have, especially in 2003, they would have loved to see Syria declare war and defend Iraq. And we would have loved to see that across the entire region. But they didn't. All they did was open the border. They allowed the safety for the resistance families.
But they couldn't have. They had no anti-aircraft weapons or anything to defend themselves, Syria, at that time.
That's arguable. We weren't very weak. We didn't have the S-400s, and yes, I suppose it would have been a kamikaze mission for Syria, and we wouldn't have found many allies in this, but I guess it would have been the right thing to do.
What role did Saudi Arabia and Qatar play in the resistance movement in Iraq?
None. They played no role. They played a role in bringing Al-Qaeda to Iraq, because the Americans' interests was to bring Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Why? To try to divide the resistance. Because the resistance was united in 2004. The South resistance was ignited. Resistance groups from Fallujah sent trainers to aid the fighters of the Mahdi army in Najaf. And when the Fallujah siege happened, number 1 and number 2, fighters in Najaf, who are Shia, lined up to give blood to the people of Fallujah. And, there were so many rallies back then where people were coming out and saying, no Sunni, no Shia, Iraqis won, we are all united against the occupation. But, of course, that's not good for the occupation to have the whole country united against you. So what they did was play a game. On the one side they were pandering to Iran's interests and trying to get the Sheikh Sistani, which is the head of the Shia, sort of like the Pope is for the Catholics, to try to quell and calm people down in South Iraq. And at the same time they were bringing Al-Qaeda. Well, at the beginning there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was all bullcrap. They were saying Zarqawi was here, Zarqawi was there, Zarqawi, the Phantom, was wherever they wanted to attack. But later, they brought these stooges in to act as Al-Qaeda. It was called the ISI. And, it was a small group that gained the ire of all the Sunni and Shia resistance groups that fought them. So, the whole idea that Qatar and Saudi Arabia was aiding the resistance is ridiculous, because Qatar and Saudi Arabia are the US's allies. So why, in their right mind, would they aid the Iraqi resistance? They even if they wanted to get rid of the Shia power in Iraq, even if they wanted to, they wouldn't, because they would have the Americans to answer for.
I don't know what else to ask, but you should just clarify that you are, when you say the ISI, you're quite aware that there's an ISI in Pakistan as well, and
Yes,
you're not talking
yeah, I'm
about
aware.
that.
It's totally different. ISI is the, I think Islamic, no, I forgot the acronym now. Just give me a moment. Islamic State in Iraq is what the name is, but it was basically Al-Qaeda. And
Okay, nothing to smile about. I'm just glad you remembered the acronym. Look, I've nothing else to ask you about. Is there anything you'd like to add?
yes, there's a few things I want to add. The resistance is one of those movements that were the most honorable and brave and ostracized, with so many lies against them, so much defamation, and it's the one that was most unsung of the heroes. And, you know, I would have loved to speak out more, and, you know, I have nothing but love for the resistance, and I just want to say, you know, now that I can, long live the resistance.
Thank you, partisan girl.